If you ate lunch in the 80s, you probably swallowed something that's banned today. Back then, no one questioned what was in the food, we just ate it. But looking back, some of those everyday bites came with risks we didn't yet understand. So what were we really eating? And why is it dangerous now? Cold cuts and yellow onions might not sound revolutionary, but in the 1980s, the liverwurst and onion sandwich was practically a working-class delicacy, especially in the Midwest and parts of the Northeast. Liverwurst, a soft, spreadable sausage made primarily from pork liver, was often slathered onto rye bread and topped with thick slices of raw onion. The flavor was bold, the smell unmistakable, and the nutrition? Well, let's just say it packed a wallop of iron and vitamin A, which made it especially popular among older generations who still remembered food shortages and wartime rationing. Originally rooted in German and Eastern European immigrant traditions, liverwurst came into American kitchens through butcher shops and delicatessens. During the post-war era and into the 80s, it remained a staple in lunchboxes and diners, a budget-friendly bite that didn't require refrigeration for long stretches, a win for convenience. However, by the late 1990s, increasing awareness about processed meats, high sodium content, and organ-based products led to a sharp decline in its popularity. Today, concerns over nitrate preservatives, saturated fats, and even potential links to cancer have led to liverwurst being quietly retired from many supermarket shelves. By the time the 1980s rolled around, gelatin molds were already deeply rooted in American culinary tradition, and few dishes demonstrated this quite like the Aspic glazed ham loaf. Yes, a meatloaf, made from finely ground ham and pork, glistening under a layer of savory gelatin. While it might look like a science experiment to modern eyes, it was once considered the height of retro elegance at potlucks and holiday tables. The Aspic wasn't just for show. It acted as a preservative, locking in moisture and extending shelf life, especially before refrigeration became fully reliable in all households. The dish's origins date back to pre-war frugality, when families used every scrap of meat they could, binding it together with eggs, breadcrumbs, and spices. In the 80s, it was typically baked, chilled, then glazed with aspic made from consommé or broth thickened with unflavored gelatin. It was sliced cold and served with pickles or mustard, though let's be honest, no condiment ever fully masked that peculiar texture. The fall of the ham loaf came with changing food safety guidelines and mounting skepticism over processed meats. In the heartland of 1980s America, church suppers and family reunions weren't complete without a bubbling tray of canned creamed corn casserole. A comfort dish through and through, it combined canned creamed corn, whole kernel corn, sour cream, Jiffy cornbread mix, and a stick of butter, because in the 80s, flavor came in bricks. Topped with cheddar or crushed crackers, it baked into a golden, gooey centerpiece that could feed a crowd on a shoestring budget. Creamed corn itself had been a pantry mainstay since the 1950s, popularized during wartime rationing and later cemented in the culinary canon through casserole culture. By the 1980s, it had become a go-to ingredient for households looking to stretch ingredients while still delivering on taste. But convenience had a hidden cost. The dish's reliance on canned vegetables brought with it growing concerns over BPA linings, excessive sodium, and preservatives like BHA and BHT, which later faced scrutiny from health watchdogs for their possible carcinogenic effects. As food safety regulations tightened and consumer habits shifted toward fresh and organic, this casserole became less common at the table and more of a nostalgic footnote. Nothing said tropical flair quite like deep-fried pork and fruit in the 1980s, and Spam and pineapple fritters were the undisputed king of that salty sweet kingdom. A product of post-war innovation and island-themed dinner parties, this dish featured thick slices of Spam and pineapple rings, battered and fried until golden and crisp. It was a mashup of mid-century ration culture and mid-Pacific imagination. Hawaiian shirts were optional, but heavily encouraged. Spam itself rose to prominence during World War II as a shelf-stable protein, and by the 1980s it had fully integrated into the American pantry. Pairing it with pineapple, another canned staple, gave families a quick, affordable dish with minimal prep and maximum crowd appeal. Served with a glaze or dipped in sweet and sour sauce, it was popular in both home kitchens and cafeterias. But time wasn't kind to the fritter. Spam, with its high levels of sodium, preservatives like sodium nitrite and saturated fat, became a target during the cholesterol-conscious wave of the late 90s. A staple in military mess halls long before it landed on suburban breakfast tables, this dish earned an unforgettable nickname among soldiers, though we'll stick with the polite version, chipped beef on toast. In the 1980s, it was still commonly served in homes, diners, and school cafeterias, especially in regions with strong military ties. Made by simmering thin slices of dried beef in a thick, creamy white gravy and pouring it over toasted bread, the dish was quick, filling, and economical, an all-in-one solution for hungry families on a budget. Its origins date back to World War II, when shelf-stable dried beef was prized for its long storage life and portability. By the time it hit mainstream kitchens, it was marketed in jars and vacuum-sealed pouches, making it even easier to prepare with just a few pantry items. The gravy, typically made with butter, flour, and whole milk, added richness, but also brought a heavy dose of fat and salt. Eventually, the nutritional profile caught up with its popularity. Processed dried beef contained high amounts of sodium, nitrates, and preservatives that later raised red flags with health agencies. Increased scrutiny over salt content and the risks of regular consumption led to its quiet phase-out. Few party snacks screamed 1980s convenience quite like Vienna sausage roll-ups, bite-sized bundles of canned sausage wrapped in crescent dough and baked until golden. Equal parts budget-friendly and oddly charming, these finger foods were a hit at birthday parties, potlucks, and even after-school snacks. The recipe called for almost no effort. Pop a can, unroll the dough, wrap, and bake. It was the kind of kitchen magic that made busy parents feel like gourmet chefs, with a side of nitrates. Vienna sausages had been around since the early 1900s, modeled after European frankfurters but heavily Americanized during wartime. Their long shelf life, low cost, and small size made them an easy pick for feeding growing families in the post-war boom. By the 1980s, pairing them with prepackaged dough turned them into an instant appetizer, often served with toothpicks and a side of mustard or grape jelly-based dip. Yes, really. But as nutritional science advanced, so did concerns. The sausages contained high levels of sodium, saturated fats, and preservatives like sodium nitrite, an additive now linked to certain cancers when consumed in large amounts. Combined with the ultra-processed dough, the humble roll-up became a red flag for dietitians. Citrus was big in the 1980s, but few expected it to come from a powdered drink mix. Tang-soaked fruit salad was a Technicolor invention that reflected the era's fascination with convenience and flavor intensity. Often served at church picnics, baby showers, or Tupperware parties, this sweet concoction featured canned fruit cocktail, maraschino cherries, mini marshmallows, and a generous pour of reconstituted tang. The whole mixture was chilled and served in plastic bowls, often accompanied by a "this one's got a kick" wink if someone had slipped in a splash of liqueur. Tang itself had skyrocketed in popularity during the space race, promoted heavily after NASA used it on Gemini missions. By the 1980s, it wasn't just a breakfast drink. It was a shortcut to turning anything into a citrus explosion. In fruit salad, it doubled as both sweetener and flavor enhancer, masking the metallic tang of canned produce and giving the dish a vivid orange hue that matched the shag carpeting. The downfall came with growing concerns about artificial dyes, high sugar content, and synthetic additives like BHT. When budgets were tight and refrigeration wasn't a guarantee, few ingredients were as reliable, or as heavily used, as powdered milk. Powdered milk pudding was a mainstay in 1980s kitchens, particularly in rural areas and large families stretching every dollar. Typically made with instant pudding mix, reconstituted powdered milk, and sometimes gelatin or margarine for texture, it chilled into a dense, sweet dessert that looked homemade even when it wasn't. Add a dollop of Cool Whip and a sprinkle of graham cracker crumbs, and you had yourself a dessert that felt fancier than it actually was. The history of powdered milk dates back to the 19th century, but it saw a massive boost during World War II and again during government surplus programs in the 70s and 80s. Families received boxes of the stuff through food assistance initiatives, and with fresh milk either too expensive or hard to keep, powdered alternatives were pressed into service. Pudding became one of the more palatable ways to make it enjoyable, or at least tolerable. Eventually, public scrutiny caught up. The powdered milk used in many products contained oxidized cholesterol and high levels of oxidants from industrial drying processes. Wasting food wasn't an option in many households during the 1980s, especially in rural America or among first-generation immigrant families where traditions ran deep and frugality was second nature. That's where chicken feet soup stepped in, both literally and economically. Made by simmering clean chicken feet with vegetables, garlic, onions, and herbs, the resulting broth was rich in collagen, hearty in flavor, and known for sticking to your ribs. The feet, despite their unsettling appearance, broke down during cooking and gave the soup a silky, almost gelatinous texture prized in many cultures for its health benefits. Historically, chicken feet have been used in soups and stocks around the world, from China to the American South, as a way to stretch every part of the bird. By the 1980s, home cooks who knew their way around a cleaver could find them cheaply at butchers or local markets. But despite their thriftiness, they didn't survive the decades unscathed. Concerns grew over foodborne pathogens, improper processing, and sanitation at poultry plants, particularly with parts like feet, which were difficult to clean thoroughly without strict controls. Regulations didn't ban the dish itself, but USDA oversight increased, and mainstream supermarkets gradually stopped stocking them. There was a time when French fries didn't just taste good, they had depth, richness, and a distinct savory edge that came from one old-school ingredient, beef tallow. Before vegetable oils took over the fryer, beef tallow French fries were the gold standard, served everywhere from local diners to the Golden Arches themselves. In fact, McDonald's used a blend of 93% beef tallow and 7% cottonseed oil for its fries until the early 1990s, creating what many still consider the best-tasting fast food fries in history. Beef tallow, rendered from sweat or fat trimmed from beef, wasn't just flavorful, it was practical. Long before shelf-stable oils and health-conscious branding, tallow was prized for its high smoke point, long fry life, and minimal waste. It was a logical choice during times of wartime rationing, and its use continued through decades of industrial kitchen practices. But public perception shifted drastically in the late 80s, driven by a growing fear of saturated fats and heart disease. Influential campaigns from health organizations pressured chains to move toward vegetable oils. Some dishes from the 1980s leave behind nostalgia, others leave behind confusion. And nestled somewhere in between was marshmallow and bologna salad, a recipe that somehow managed to make its way into community cookbooks and potluck tables across the Midwest. Often served chilled in molded shapes or as a salad in name only, it typically featured chopped bologna, mini marshmallows, mayonnaise or Miracle Whip, and sometimes crushed pineapple or pickles, depending on the household's loyalty to sweet or savory. It was the edible equivalent of a coin toss, either oddly appealing or instantly regrettable. This peculiar pairing didn't appear by accident. Processed meats and shelf-stable ingredients were central to 1980s meal planning, especially in households relying on food assistance or bulk discounts. Bologna was cheap and versatile. Marshmallows added a sugar hit in a decade that loved its sweetness. More importantly, it was a no-cook, quick assembly option when time, money, and refrigeration were all in short supply. What ultimately doomed the dish wasn't just shifting tastes, it was science. Bologna's high nitrate content, when combined with other processed foods, drew increasing scrutiny. The microwave revolutionized kitchens in the 1980s, turning stovetop staples into push-button meals almost overnight. Among its most infamous success stories, microwaved bacon strips. Promising crispy results in minutes without the splatter or cleanup, this method quickly became a breakfast time favorite. Pre-packaged in plastic trays or paper-lined pouches, These bacon slices were often partially cooked at the factory and simply zapped at home to finish. They were sold under names like Ready Bacon and became a fixture in office break rooms, dorms, and hurried households alike. Microwaved bacon wasn't just a novelty, it met a real need. With more women entering the workforce and less time for morning routines, convenience became king. Plus, bacon's long shelf life in its pre-cooked form meant fewer worries about spoilage. It wasn't gourmet, but it was fast, salty, and satisfying. But with that speed came issues. The process often involved additives like sodium nitrite and preservatives to stabilize the meat, along with packaging materials that later raised concerns when heated. By the late 90s, studies began linking microwave-safe plastics to potential hormone disruption and carcinogen release. Long before seafood counters were stocked with fresh choices year-round, canned was the name of the game, especially when it came to shellfish. Canned oyster stew was a prime example, showing up on 1980s dinner tables as a comforting, creamy bowl of briny indulgence. Made by simmering canned oysters in a base of milk, butter, and pepper, sometimes with a pinch of celery salt or paprika, this stew was often served with crackers or toast and reserved for holidays, Friday nights, or anyone feeling just a bit fancy on a budget. Historically, oysters were once food for the working class, and their canned form became popular in the early 20th century as coastal harvests were preserved and shipped inland. The stew remained a favorite among older generations and church suppers, offering a taste of tradition in a fast-heating can. No shucking, no shells, just heat and serve. But by the late 20th century, health and safety regulators began raising alarms. Contamination risks in mass-harvested oysters, including heavy metals, bacteria like Vibrio, and even botulism in improperly canned goods, led to stricter monitoring. As the microwave took over American kitchens, no item better defined dinnertime efficiency than the iconic TV dinner tray. Chief among its offerings was frozen Salisbury steak, a meat patty swimming in brown gravy, flanked by instant mashed potatoes and a side of overly enthusiastic peas. Introduced as part of the post-war convenience food boom and cemented in pop culture through endless advertising, it was marketed as both modern and comforting. Just peel the film, heat for a few minutes, and dinner was served, preferably in front of a wood-paneled zenith. Salisbury steak itself wasn't new. Created during the late 19th century as a health food by Dr. J.H. Salisbury, the dish had morphed into a budget-friendly standby by the 1980s. What landed in freezer aisles, however, often bore little resemblance to its ground beef origins. Many versions contained textured vegetable protein fillers, artificial flavor enhancers like MSG, and meat from mixed animal sources, all bound together with binding agents that required more chemistry than cuisine. Problems emerged as food safety standards evolved. Reports of listeria outbreaks in improperly stored frozen meals, alongside the rise in public concern over sodium, fat content, and synthetic additives, led to tighter FDA scrutiny. Before boutique bakeries and air fryers took over, the richest, flakiest donuts came from a method as old as cast iron itself: frying in rendered pork fat. Lard-fried donuts were a holdover from a time when nothing in the kitchen went to waste and flavor trumped calorie counts. In the 1980s, these homemade treats, often made with flour, sugar, eggs, and yeast, were fried in bubbling lard until golden brown, then dipped in cinnamon sugar or glazed with icing that cracked when cooled. The result was a crisp exterior, a tender middle, and an aroma that practically pulled neighbors in from down the street. Historically, lard was the default cooking fat in American kitchens, prized for its high smoke point and ability to produce tender baked goods. The switch to vegetable shortening didn't happen en masse until the late 20th century. And even then, many rural families and bakeries held fast to tradition, especially when it came to donuts. What changed wasn't the taste, it was the science. Lard is high in saturated fat and cholesterol, and by the late 80s it found itself at the center of public health debates. Some foods survive through flavor, others through function. And then there's pickled pig's feet jelly, a dish that owed its longevity to pure practicality. Common in the American South and Midwest well into the 1980s, this dish combined economy, preservation, and a strong stomach. After boiling pig's feet until the collagen-rich bones and connective tissue dissolved, the resulting broth thickened into a natural gelatin. Add vinegar, salt, and a few spices, pour it into jars, and let it set. The result? A tangy, wobbly jelly that could be eaten cold, sliced, or spread, sometimes with crackers, sometimes just with resolve. This wasn't culinary eccentricity, it was necessity. Families during the Depression and post-war periods learned to stretch every part of the animal, and pig's feet were often among the cheapest cuts. The jelly itself wasn't wasted. It preserved the product, added texture, and delivered nutrients like calcium and gelatin at little cost. By the 1980s, it remained a niche but respected dish in traditional households and corner store delis. Its fall came not from disgust, but from regulation. Improper home canning methods led to concerns over botulism, and USDA guidelines became stricter regarding acid levels and sterilization. Desserts in the 1980s weren't just sweet. They were engineered for speed, shelf life, and maximum effect with minimal effort. Instant coffee whipped cream pie checked all three boxes. A no-bake dessert made by folding instant coffee granules into whipped topping, often Cool Whip, then spooning the airy mixture into a graham cracker crust. This pie offered a caffeine kick with the illusion of elegance. Some recipes added gelatin for structure. Others used condensed milk or chocolate syrup, but all shared one thing: simplicity powered by pantry staples. The rise of this pie coincided with America's love affair with instant everything. From powdered soups to pudding mixes, convenience foods dominated home cooking. Coffee-flavored desserts had a grown-up appeal without requiring espresso machines or stovetop brewing, something many kitchens didn't yet have. For home cooks juggling work, kids, and potlucks, it was a way to bring something fancy without turning on the oven. Over time, the cracks began to show, literally and figuratively. Hydrogenated oils in whipped toppings, high fructose corn syrup, and artificial coffee flavorings drew increasing scrutiny. When grocery budgets were tight and church cookbooks were gospel, casseroles ruled the kitchen, and few were as uniquely 1980s as the Tuna and Miracle Whip casserole. Made with canned tuna, egg noodles or elbow macaroni, peas, and a generous dollop of Miracle Whip in place of mayonnaise or cream, this dish was baked until bubbly and topped with crushed potato chips or breadcrumbs. It was thrifty, fast, and creamy in a way that only emulsified salad dressing could deliver. The popularity of this casserole wasn't accidental. Miracle Whip, introduced during the Great Depression, was less expensive than mayonnaise and packed with sugar and spices. By the 1980s, it had become a staple in many American kitchens, especially in the Midwest. Combined with canned tuna, a protein that didn't require refrigeration and was regularly promoted in school lunch programs, it made for a dependable meal that could feed a crowd on very little. But as food labeling laws evolved and dietary awareness increased, Miracle Whip drew attention for its high sugar content, processed oils, and the inclusion of preservatives like potassium sorbate. Few dishes in the 1980s combined old-world preservation with modern appetizer culture, quite like salt-cured mackerel pate. Typically made by soaking salt-cured mackerel to reduce its intense brininess, then blending it with cream cheese, lemon juice, onions, and herbs. The result was a spreadable, smoky, salty paste served with rye crackers or cocktail bread. It was a hit at holiday parties, wine and cheese nights, and potlucks where adventurous palates still respected wartime wisdom. Salt-curing fish had been a preservation method for centuries, especially in Scandinavian and Eastern European households where refrigeration was once unreliable or unavailable. Mackerel, oily and rich in omega-3s, was easy to preserve and pack with flavor. In post-war America, imported salt-cured mackerel became more available in specialty markets and was even promoted in food magazines as an exotic, sophisticated ingredient, though the smell often told a different story. As health awareness evolved, the dish's reputation began to shift. The high sodium levels required for curing were flagged as potential risks for hypertension. Movie nights in the 1980s weren't complete without a bowl or a bucket of popcorn so saturated with butter-flavored topping it left fingerprints on the VHS remote. Known informally in theaters and homes alike as butter-drowned popcorn, it wasn't just a snack. It was a ritual. Whether poured from a pump at the concession stand or doused at home from a stovetop saucepan, the more golden and glistening, the better. And while the flavor was unmistakably rich, that buttery coating wasn't exactly butter. The topping used in theaters and many pre-packaged microwave versions was often made from partially hydrogenated oils mixed with artificial butter flavoring and food dyes. It gave the illusion of indulgence without the cost or perishability of real dairy. At home, popcorn popped in oil and drowned in margarine or similar substitutes offered the same effect, economical and crowd-pleasing. But the buttery bliss came at a price. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, researchers began sounding alarms about trans fats found in hydrogenated oils. Meanwhile, the artificial flavoring diacetyl, used in many commercial butter flavorings, was linked to respiratory illness in factory workers exposed to it in concentrated amounts. In communities where waste was never an option and resourcefulness ruled the kitchen, no part of the animal went unused, including the blood. Goose blood pudding, a dish once quietly common in certain ethnic enclaves across the U.S., especially among Polish, German, and Hungarian immigrants, was as much about heritage as it was about thrift. Traditionally made during fall butchering season, the dish involved mixing fresh goose blood with vinegar to prevent clotting, then combining it with barley, onions, fat, and spices. The mixture was cooked into a dense, sausage-like pudding, sliced and pan-fried or served warm with root vegetables or rye. By the 1980s, it had become a rarity, but still held ground in older households and Eastern European butcher shops. It wasn't an everyday meal. It was tied to cultural identity and seasonal necessity, especially when families raised and processed their own poultry. The iron-rich content was even seen as beneficial, long before supplements filled the same gap. But food safety guidelines eventually caught up. The USDA and FDA began regulating the handling and sale of animal blood for human consumption, citing concerns over bacterial contamination, improper storage, and blood-borne pathogens. Shelf-stable and suspiciously smooth, this was the kind of snack that lived in your grandmother's pantry and your uncle's tackle box. Potted meat spread on crackers was a 1980s classic for anyone who needed a quick bite without refrigeration, reheating, or much thinking. Sold in small cans, the spread was typically made from a blend of mechanically separated meat, often pork or chicken, mixed with salt, spices, preservatives, and stabilizers. Just pop the lid, grab a sleeve of saltines, and you had yourself a snack that could outlast a blackout. This type of preserved meat dates back to the 19th century, originally developed as a way to extend the shelf life of meat without the need for cold storage. It surged in popularity during wartime and remained a staple in low-income households, outdoor kits, and lunchboxes well into the 1980s. The appeal was obvious: cheap, filling, and practically immortal. But the very things that made it last also made it a target. By the late 90s, health authorities raised concerns over the high levels of sodium, saturated fat, and preservatives like sodium nitrate and BHA. Simmering all day on stovetops across the South and beyond, this dish was less about presentation and more about patience. Sugar-cured ham hock greens were a staple of 1980s soul food kitchens. Collards or turnip greens slow-cooked with a hefty piece of smoked ham hock, cured in brown sugar and salt. The fat rendered into the pot liquor, the greens soaked up the flavor, and what came out was a dish that defined comfort and sodium content. Ham hocks were traditionally used to flavor tough greens not because they were trendy, but because they were cheap. Curing with sugar added both sweetness and preservation power, making the cut shelf-stable in smokehouses before refrigeration became widespread. For generations, this dish symbolized resilience, thrift, and a connection to agricultural heritage. By the 80s, it remained a household favorite, especially in working-class and rural homes, served with cornbread and hot sauce on the side. Eventually, though, science started reading the label. The curing process relied heavily on nitrates and salt, both of which drew scrutiny for links to high blood pressure, heart disease, and cancer risk when consumed frequently. It was the appetizer of PTA meetings, Tupperware parties, and last-minute school functions, celery sticks filled with cheese whiz. On the surface, it was the perfect blend of crunchy and creamy. Vegetable meets dairy in a convenience marriage that required no refrigeration until after opening and no culinary skill whatsoever. Simply uncap the jar, scoop, and press into celery like spackling compound on a green wall. For a generation raised on processed convenience, it was a snack that felt oddly futuristic. Cheese Whiz itself was born in the 1950s but hit its stride in the 1980s when time-saving food products became essential to working families. Marketed as a cheese alternative that melted easily and lasted forever, it became a fixture in pantries and lunchboxes alike. Pairing it with celery added a touch of nutritional balance, at least in theory, and gave the illusion of wholesomeness in an otherwise highly engineered snack. What unraveled the spread wasn't taste, it was transparency. By the 2000s, scrutiny over artificial dyes, high sodium content, emulsifiers, and the near absence of real cheese led to questions about its classification. Among the more resourceful street foods of the 1980s, especially in immigrant and working-class communities, tacos filled with boiled beef tongue quietly held their place at the table. Boiled tongue tacos, often referred to as tacos de lengua, were prepared by simmering beef tongue for hours in water seasoned with garlic, onion, and bay leaf until tender. Once cooled, the outer skin was peeled away, revealing a soft, rich cut of meat that was then sliced, seared, and tucked into warm tortillas with salsa, cilantro, and chopped onion. This dish wasn't a novelty. It was born from necessity. Tongue, though overlooked by mainstream markets, was cheap, nutrient-dense, and readily available at local butchers. It had been a staple in traditional Mexican, Jewish, and Eastern European cuisines for generations, and during the 80s, it remained common in home kitchens, taco trucks, and family-owned diners. It offered deep flavor at a fraction of the cost of more popular cuts. The trouble came later, as concerns over prion diseases, particularly bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease, emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s. USDA guidelines tightened around organ meats, especially those connected to the central nervous system. Remember the unpasteurized raw milk? Well, people didn't just use it to drink. They ended up making farm cheese out of it too. It was commonly made in a lot of rural America, especially on family farms and within Amish communities throughout the nation. Safety regulations really weren't what they are now, as you can clearly tell by this point. Raw milk cheeses were considered a way to preserve dairy, while also working as a nice little topping for your meat. Plus, some of them even made enough of the stuff to sell, and they would market it as this all-natural product too. Back then, the dangers of consuming cheese made from unpasteurized milk just weren't well known. Also, this cheese was exceptionally rich and creamy. It had a stronger flavor too, and it would be even better depending on how aged it was. The best one was probably Colby or Jack cheese from the Midwest or California though. At least they were popular until they started causing salmonella, listeria, and brucellosis within the population. This led to a lot more proactive government intervention. The United States Department of Agriculture, for example, started to encourage pasteurization for most cheeses. Throughout the 50s, many states would ban the sale of this kind of cheese, and by the 70s, it got outlawed completely. Mornings in the 1970s often started the same way. Parents sipping their coffee, kids getting ready for school, and, in many households, children drinking coffee right alongside the adults. It wasn't unusual. In fact, in some families, it was encouraged, especially in certain cultural traditions where a little coffee with milk and sugar was considered perfectly fine for young ones. Some parents even believed it helped build character or made kids feel more grown up. Coffee for kids wasn't just about the caffeine, it was part of breakfast. Some children dunked their toast into it, while others drank a watered-down version, often loaded with sugar. It wasn't uncommon for grandparents to pour a little into a toddler's bottle, swearing it would keep them calm, an idea that hasn't exactly aged well. But as health studies evolved, concerns over caffeine's effects on developing bodies became harder to ignore. Doctors warned that regular consumption could stunt growth, interfere with sleep, and even lead to increased heart rates. While coffee itself was never banned for kids, the cultural norm slowly faded. Today, it's more likely to raise eyebrows than fill sippy cups. But back then, a cup of joe before school wasn't shocking. It was just part of growing up, one jittery sip at a time. Seafood has long been praised as a healthy, protein-rich option, but in the 1960s, some portions came with an unexpected side effect: mercury exposure. As industrial pollution increased, heavy metals made their way into oceans and rivers, accumulating in fish that millions consumed daily. At the time, awareness of mercury's dangers was limited, and food regulations had yet to impose strict monitoring. Consumers enjoyed their seafood dinners unaware that certain species carried levels of the toxic element high enough to pose serious health risks. Mercury is particularly insidious because it builds up in the body over time. While a single meal wouldn't cause immediate harm, consistent exposure could lead to neurological damage, developmental issues in children, and even kidney failure. Pregnant women were at the highest risk, as mercury could interfere with fetal brain development. Yet, in the mid-century push for convenience and affordability, few questioned what lurked beneath the surface of their favorite fish dishes. It wasn't until the 1970s, after growing scientific research and public outcry, that regulatory agencies like the FDA established strict mercury limits in seafood. Lead-soldered canned foods were actually a lot more common than you would think. Leading just is a bad idea, but I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they didn't know what they were doing back then. It was a pretty unrecognized public health risk. Canning technology was definitely picking up speed, but the deep, nitty-gritty effects of all this modernization were still subjects that were being studied. Lead-based soldering was unfortunately too common before all of this advancement, and it was extremely common throughout military rationing. Now, modern industries use welded seam canning, but most cans had been sealed with lead because it was really easy to work with, making sure that the can was as airtight as it could be. It was very resistant to corrosion, and it had a very long shelf life. The issue happens when, well, literally anything unexpected occurs. Say you're just chatting away with your wife while you unpack the groceries and get them ready for the shelf, and you just happen to drop a can. Happens to the best of us, right? Well, let's say the interior was damaged because the big bad fall actually hurt the can. Now you have your food in contact with lead. Let's say it wasn't your fault at all, it was just soldered improperly. By the 1970s, the diet food industry was booming. With calorie counting in full swing, people were looking for ways to satisfy their sweet tooth without the guilt. Saccharin became the answer. Found in everything from diet sodas to sugar-free desserts, it was a game changer. Hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, yet with none of the calories. It didn't taste exactly like sugar, but for those determined to stay slim, it was close enough. Saccharin had actually been around since the late 1800s, but it wasn't until the mid-20th century that it took over the diet market. People stirred it into their coffee, poured it over cereal, and downed it in soft drinks like Tab. It was everywhere, until scientists started raising concerns. In the early 1970s, studies linked saccharin to bladder cancer in lab rats, setting off alarm bells. The FDA responded by mandating warning labels on products containing the sweetener, effectively scaring off a lot of consumers. Despite the controversy, saccharin never fully disappeared. Later research suggested the rat studies didn't translate directly to humans, and by 2000, the cancer warning was removed. Today, it's still around, though it competes with newer artificial sweeteners. Back then, though, it was the diet craze's best friend, until it wasn't. So another really interesting bit of info about 1950s culinary habits is that slow and steady does in fact win the race. If you think being turned into a soup is winning, turtle soup was one of the most common ways for people to warm themselves up in the winter, pass the afternoon, or just have something nutritious while still keeping their finances somewhat in check. That was just if you were buying the stuff, by the way. Most people just began to catch their own turtles near ponds, rivers, and other areas where they would be abundant. Turtle soup was seen as this extremely medicinal, rejuvenating dish that would help you get right back up on your feet. Not sure how much of that is a factual side effect of the dish or just plain old placebo, but what I do know is that this odd dish was a regular on everyone's menus. To the point that the government actually had to introduce regulatory laws to help the turtle populations get back on their feet. People began to overfarm them to the point that the local numbers were dwindling badly. They even became endangered, and that's when the powers that be decided it's time to stop abusing these poor little things just hiding away in their shells, minding their own business. In the 1970s, home canning was more than just a hobby. It was a way to stretch the grocery budget and keep the pantry stocked year-round. Families filled their shelves with jars of green beans, corn, and carrots, all preserved with time-tested methods passed down through generations. But while fruits and jams could be safely canned with a boiling water bath, low-acid vegetables were another story. Without a pressure cooker, those innocent-looking jars could turn into ticking time bombs for botulism. For years, many home canners relied on boiling water alone, believing that if it's sealed, it was safe. Some added aspirin or vinegar, thinking it would help ward off bacteria. Others simply trusted the process. After all, their grandparents had done it. The problem? Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria behind botulism, thrives in low oxygen, low-acid environments like improperly canned vegetables. It doesn't change the taste, smell, or appearance of food, making it nearly impossible to detect until symptoms appear. As cases of botulism poisoning mounted, food safety officials began cracking down, emphasizing the need for pressure canning. Olestra was born out of the 1960s drive to reinvent everyday food. This fat substitute promised guilt-free indulgence without the extra calories. Its introduction coincided with a time when scientific optimism often outpaced regulatory oversight. As the industry celebrated a marvel of chemical engineering, food safety protocols were only just beginning to catch up, leaving a gap that allowed unanticipated health concerns to emerge. Consumers embraced Olestra for its novelty and promise of a lighter future, even as emerging reports hinted at severe gastrointestinal distress. Laboratory findings eventually revealed that, while free of traditional fat calories, this compound could disrupt the absorption of essential vitamins and cause digestive discomfort. This paradox, a product engineered to aid dietary goals that ultimately compromised nutritional well-being, became a cautionary tale in modern food history. Interestingly, advertisements once lauded Olestra as the solution for those seeking to enjoy their favorite snacks without compromise. However, as adverse effects accumulated, both scientists and regulators pushed for tighter safety measures, marking a significant turning point in food additive scrutiny. Potted meat is something that's definitely not a niche or something Americans are unfamiliar with. As our history says, we've actually been potted meatheads for quite a while now. It was one of the most widely available sources of protein in most American homes after all, to the point that the most popular companies became household names. Whether you were using Armour's Tangier meat or Underwood's slightly saltier ones, it was a spreadable meat product that made the difference between going to bed hungry and going to bed somewhat full. Unlike Spam or corned beef, though, potted meat was pureed and made into almost a mesh of meat instead of anything firm or very chewable. Now you might be wondering what sodium nitrate is doing here, since potted meat is already meant to be a way of preserving it. Industry standards called for more security, though, and preservatives like nitrate help to keep large-scale batches from spoiling. That's no reason to put 300 to 500 milligrams of the stuff per serving, though. I mean, that's enough to really cause some cancer-related issues. While you can still get this nitrate-infused potted meat today, the concentration is a lot lower than it was before thanks to the backlash people gave. We're going to pause for a second and kind of go back to the start. For much of the 20th century, canned foods were a kitchen essential. They were cheap, convenient, and had an impressively long shelf life. Whether it was a can of soup, vegetables, or condensed milk, chances were high that the can itself was sealed with lead solder. It seemed like a practical solution at the time. Lead was easy to work with, and it created a strong, airtight seal that kept food from spoiling. But what people didn't realize was that the lead in those seams wasn't just staying on the outside. Over time, especially with acidic foods like tomatoes or fruit, the lead could leach into the food. And unlike a bad ingredient you can taste or smell, lead poisoning happens slowly. Symptoms could take years to appear, affecting the nervous system, brain function, and even childhood development. The real turning point came in the 1970s, when health experts made the undeniable link between lead exposure and serious health risks. By 1991, lead-soldered food cans were completely banned in the US, replaced with safer manufacturing methods. While today's cans are lead-free, the lesson stuck. Sometimes the biggest dangers aren't the ones you can see. A household staple for decades, canned tuna was a go-to choice for quick meals and affordable protein. Packed with convenience and a mild flavor that fit everything from sandwiches to casseroles, its popularity surged throughout the 20th century. But hidden beneath its silver lid was an ingredient no one had bargained for: mercury. Some brands of tuna contained alarmingly high levels of the toxic metal, a risk that went largely unnoticed in the 1960s when food safety regulations had yet to catch up with modern science. Back then, concerns over contaminants weren't front-page news. The average consumer had little reason to suspect that a simple tuna salad might come with a side of neurological damage. Mercury, a heavy metal that can accumulate in the body, posed serious health risks, especially for pregnant women and young children. Symptoms of mercury poisoning included cognitive impairments, muscle weakness, and developmental issues, hardly what anyone expected from a lunchtime staple. As research progressed, regulatory agencies stepped in. By the 1970s, the FDA began imposing stricter limits on mercury levels in seafood, and today, guidelines recommend limiting the consumption of certain fish. Ketchup's near and dear to everyone's hearts, but most of us are used to it being red on its own. In the 50s, though, people actually bought artificially colored ketchup. This was completely red, almost obsessively so. In hindsight, it wasn't that odd for food colorings and synthetic dyes to be used, but towards the 50s, and particularly the end of the 50s, started using all kinds of strong dyes. There was an almost strange obsession with getting the perfect cherry red aesthetic for each ketchup company. All of them were doing this: Hunt's, Del Monte's, and even Heinz. They started to have it in just about every ketchup product they released. This one never really became illegal. It's still something they do to this day. But there definitely was a lot of demand for natural ketchup lately. I kind of get it. It's just a dip made out of tomatoes, so why bother making it extra red? These next few items are really going to take you for a spin. I mean, we've had horses and turtles so far, but these really come into the top 3. By the 1970s, margarine had secured its place as the healthier alternative to butter. It was cheaper, lasted longer, and, thanks to trans fats, stayed solid at room temperature while giving baked goods that perfect flakiness. Fast food chains and restaurants took full advantage, using partially hydrogenated oils for frying everything from French fries to fried chicken. The result? Crispy, golden perfection with a long shelf life. But what seemed like a miracle ingredient turned out to be a silent killer. Trans fats raised bad cholesterol, lowered good cholesterol, and increased the risk of heart disease, without people even realizing it. For decades, the food industry brushed off concerns, marketing margarine as a healthier alternative while deep fryers across America sizzled with heart-clogging oils. The science was catching up, though, and by the early 2000s, studies confirmed what researchers had suspected for years. Trans fats were among the worst fats you could consume. Regulations followed, and by 2015, the FDA officially declared trans fats unsafe. Companies scrambled to reformulate products, and today, margarine isn't what it used to be. While fried food never went out of style, the days of trans fat-loaded cooking oils are over. In the 1960s, packaging was more about durability and design than long-term safety, and nowhere was that more evident than in lead-based paint on food containers. Vibrant labels, eye-catching colors, and a sturdy finish made these containers look appealing on store shelves. But hidden beneath the surface was a toxic hazard. Lead-based paint, commonly used in everything from household walls to children's toys, also found its way onto food packaging, a decision that, in hindsight, was as dangerous as it sounds. At the time, lead's risks weren't fully understood by the general public. While scientists had long suspected its dangers, regulations were slow to catch up. The problem was that lead doesn't just stay on the surface. Over time, it can leach into food, especially acidic products like canned tomatoes. Consumers had no way of knowing that their favorite pantry staples might come with a side of neurotoxicity. The health risks were severe. Chronic exposure to lead can cause developmental issues in children, memory problems in adults, and even organ failure in extreme cases. As research mounted, the government stepped in. By the late 1970s, lead-based paints were banned from food-related products. Cooking fast food in Crisco with trans fats was an interesting little rebranding project. The government came up with its own very interesting little ways to respond to the rising health concerns that people had begun to rightfully have. Over the years, they had literally been exposed to drugs and other toxic substances in their food after all. One of those was the entire hype around hydrogenation, or basically, turning liquid vegetable oil into a cooking fat. For Crisco, that was cottonseed oil first, and later, soybean oil. It was marketed as a much superior alternative to lard and butter, the latter of which was starting to become really expensive for most people to buy, at least while the economy was still reeling from the entire first half of the 20th century. Funnily enough, trans fats were later linked to increased risks of heart disease, and they actually weren't healthier for you at all. Crisco stopped using them a while before we hit the 2000s, so don't worry. It's just the regular old oil for us now. In the 1970s, grabbing a snack off the grocery shelf was simple. No long ingredient lists, no allergy warnings, just food in a package. If a product contained peanuts, dairy, or wheat, it was up to the consumer to figure it out. Those with food allergies had to play detective, carefully reading labels, if they even listed all the ingredients. There were no bold warnings, no may contain statements, and certainly no standardized regulations to prevent cross-contamination. Food manufacturers weren't trying to be careless. The awareness just wasn't there. While allergies existed, they weren't as widely recognized as they are today. A peanut butter factory might also process cookies, but there was no obligation to disclose that. For those with severe allergies, eating processed food could be a game of Russian roulette. One mislabeled snack and a hospital trip wasn't out of the question. The turning point came in the late 1990s and early 2000s when food allergy cases became more widely studied, and advocacy groups pushed for better labeling. In 2004, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act was passed, requiring clear identification of the top 8 allergens. In an era defined by boundless optimism and experimental remedies, a curious tonic emerged: Radithor, or radioactive water. During a time when scientific breakthroughs were celebrated without the benefit of modern safety protocols, this radium-infused elixir was marketed as a miracle drink, promising renewed vitality. Companies boldly touted its rejuvenating properties while food safety oversight was in its infancy, and regulations lagged behind the fervor for innovation. Although endorsements by well-known figures lent it credibility, users eventually discovered that regular consumption led to severe health risks, including bone decay and radiation poisoning, a grim reminder that not every scientific experiment was a step forward. Intriguingly, advertisements depicted Radithor as a fountain of youth in a bottle, a claim that today would undoubtedly trigger public outcry rather than applause. Its popularity stemmed from the era's trust in emerging technologies and a willingness to embrace unconventional treatments during uncertain times. The tale of Radithor serves as a compelling chapter in our culinary and pharmaceutical history, highlighting a period when progress sometimes outpaced prudence. Opium-based tonics were actually a lot more common than you would think. Tonics used to have morphine, codeine, and opium in them, and in pretty jarring amounts. You would think people would have learned their lesson from absinthe, but at least that was just paranoia at work. Opium actually is pretty addictive and has some incredible potential for long-term damage once the damage is done. We talked a little about the Harrison Narcotics Act, and it is relevant here too. It was only after tighter regulations finally made a dent in the supply of opium that the government started having a grip on it. Before that, it was pretty much the most common drug you could get for yourself throughout the entire country. People bought it for relaxation, pain relief, cough suppression, and a lot more. Maybe it just made them feel good, but people seemed to definitely think that they found a miracle tonic, even though they didn't. Even after it was banned, illegal supply systems and smugglers would still keep opium sales active throughout the 50s, especially in underground markets. Dinner parties in the 1970s had one dish that seemed to defy logic: the savory Jell-O mold. A wobbly tower of gelatin, often packed with processed meats, canned vegetables, and a suspiciously artificial glow, it was a centerpiece of many tables. Whether it was ham and lime gelatin, chicken suspended in tomato aspic, or a seafood salad encased in lemon-flavored Jell-O, this culinary oddity was both a conversation starter and, for some, a challenge to eat. Jell-O molds had been around for decades, but after World War II, food companies aggressively marketed them as an easy, elegant way to serve meals. Housewives clipped recipes from magazines, creating gelatin-packed creations filled with everything from olives to pimentos. Processed meats like Spam or bologna often found their way into the mix, held together by gelatin and thickened with mayonnaise. It was a product of its time, efficient, visually striking, and heavy on artificial additives like food dyes and stabilizers. As food safety and nutrition research evolved, concerns over processed meats, excessive artificial ingredients, and sodium levels grew. By the 1980s, the popularity of savory gelatin dishes faded. Today, they're more of a retro curiosity than a dinner staple. So we aren't done with the list of harmful substances that used to be in our food just yet. Next, we have canned fish with mercury in it. And yes, it was lethal. While different times in the 50s and different companies each had their own ideas of what the ideal amount of mercury was, most people were definitely in on the secret. So the thing about mercury is that it's actually very present in the environment, but that's always been in very manageable amounts. It wasn't until there was such a sharp increase in coal burning and chemical manufacturing that mercury levels shot through the roof throughout the country. It also led to a higher amount of a particularly dangerous kind of mercury, which was methyl mercury. Not just the cans. People were starting to get really concerned about the amount of mercury in their fish, too. Plus, testing was really limited, and there were very strict regulations on mercury content. It wasn't until the 1970s that this would change, and a cap of 1 parts per million was set on canned tuna. This was a start, but think of all the damage it already did. How many times did your grandpa potentially eat mercury-laced mackerel or tuna? In the Midwest, especially around Wisconsin, there was a holiday tradition that might make modern food safety inspectors break into a cold sweat. Raw ground beef served on rye bread, often topped with onions and a dash of salt and pepper. Known as cannibal sandwiches, this dish wasn't some underground delicacy. It was a staple at family gatherings, particularly around Christmas, when butchers sold the freshest beef and people trusted their local meat markets to provide high-quality, bacteria-free cuts. Eating raw meat might sound risky today, but for decades, it was considered perfectly normal in certain communities. The preparation was simple. Freshly ground beef, preferably from a trusted butcher, was spread onto slices of rye bread, sometimes with a smear of butter or mustard. Some enjoyed it with a side of pickles, others with a cold beer. To those who grew up with it, the taste was rich, the texture smooth, and the risk? Barely a thought. That changed as foodborne illnesses became a growing concern. By the late 20th century, increased cases of E. coli and salmonella made raw beef a serious health hazard. In the mid-20th century, the agricultural industry was on a mission to maximize production, and antibiotics played a key role in that effort. One in particular, chloramphenicol, became a popular choice for keeping livestock healthy and increasing meat yields. Farmers saw it as an efficient way to prevent infections in crowded conditions, while food producers benefited from higher output. For a time, it seemed like a win-win, until scientists uncovered the serious health risks lurking beneath the surface. Unlike some antibiotics that merely disrupt digestion, chloramphenicol posed a far more alarming danger: aplastic anemia, a rare but potentially fatal condition where the body stops producing enough blood cells. The problem wasn't just with direct exposure. Traces of the antibiotic could linger in meat and dairy products, making their way onto dinner tables across the country. Consumers had no way of knowing that their Sunday roast might come with a side of medical complications. As evidence mounted, regulators took action. By the 1980s, chloramphenicol was banned in food production in many countries, including the United States. Today, strict testing ensures that no remnants make it into the food supply. Red dye number 2, or otherwise known as amaranth, was actually one of the most popular artificial food colorings ever produced. If you ever had candy, soda, processed meat, hell, if you bought certain kinds of makeup, there were high chances this was either on your skin or in your system. Now, normally, people didn't care too much about it. I mean, it's the 50s, that's kind of on brand for the time period, right? And why would they? It was resistant to heat, it could be used in liquid form and powder, it was a lot cheaper, easy to produce in bulk, it could be used with everything, and the color was just spectacular. So some of you might immediately express a lot of enthusiasm after hearing that. But some of you might think, what's the catch? Raise a suspicious eyebrow, or just think that this is too good to be true. And you'd be exactly right. The Food and Drugs Administration outlawed amaranth in around 1976 because studies had suggested that it actually increased the chances of cancer. Scientists had begun to link potential carcinogenic effects, and amaranth in particular came under scrutiny. There were all sorts of rumors about it. From your head to your toes, it could give you tumors anywhere like mosquitoes give you rashes. This pretty much sealed the deal for the industry, and as they wanted to get ahead of the issue, the ban became a pretty clear solution. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to let us know if you tried any of these foods in the comments below.